All right, thank you for joining us. This is our second class doing class like this due to COVID. And I miss having you guys here, seeing smiling faces and people to ask questions and give feedback and so forth. That's all right. This is going to work for as long as we need it to. So last class we talked about imperialism, specifically the scramble for Africa. Today we're talking about American imperialism and the United States getting in on these imperial expansions. But before I get to that, a couple things that I forgot to cover last class that I think hopefully will be helpful. They're on a diagram on here on the chart. So we've talked about conquest, the idea of conquest, which is basically what this idea of imperialism is. And in conquest, you have people and land. Excuse my horrible handwriting, but that's okay. In conquest, you are conquering over people and land. And in conquest, the reason why it's helpful is because out of people and land, you get things like taxes, resources, raw resources, laborers. You get laborers, there was a fourth one, I can't remember what it was, soldiers. You get these things from conquest that then go back in and feed your desire to conquest. It gives you more resources to expand your conquest. And so it's almost like a self-perpetuating cycle. Conquest, you're conquering people and land, they become a source of taxes, raw resources, laborers, slave labor more often than not, and soldiers also. We saw this in the Congo Free State with King Leopold, in India, which we've not talked a lot about in this class, where you had Indians fighting for British wars, for example. And so they become resources that go in and feed this hunger for conquest. But it's not just conquest for the sake of conquest. A lot of times it's for economic purposes. So let's say I have a factory. If I have a factory, the inputs into this factory are raw resources. And let's say this is, I don't know, a t-shirt factory. And you have things like cotton and raw resource coming into your factory. And then coming out, you have finished goods. But if you're a small country like Britain, you don't have a lot of resources. You're not naturally rich in resources. And so if you don't have those resources, what you need is conquest. And so that's how you see pretty small European countries dominating Asia, dominating Africa, is because this is where the Industrial Revolution happened. We talked about the role of coal, and coal important for steam engines, and how that's fundamental to driving the engines of industrialization. And so you have these small powers engaging imperialism in conquest, competing for raw resources. These European powers are competing with each other. And so what I want you to notice, because after this class, going into the next class, we're getting into the 20th century with this class, and I'm basically going to stop at 1913. 1914 is where World War I begins, and so I'm trying to lay the groundwork for World War I. And all of this is what we've talked about, the competitive model. You're competing for resources, you're competing for laborers, you're competing for land, industrialization, you're competing for technology, who can industrialize the quickest, grow the quickest economy. And a lot of this becomes almost an arms race. All these European countries, and remember, we've talked about social Darwinism and the role of race in all of this. And these European powers believe that we are the superior race. And so you have all of these different types of competition where in Europe, no single one country is the hegemon or dominates the continent or the globe for that matter. And so all of these countries are taking account, hey, we are pretty equal, we have a lot going for us against these other European countries. Why can't we be the dominant power in the globe? And so you have this competition that is ramping up 1860s, 70s, 80s, up to 1914, where World War I kicks off. And it's very largely driven by this idea of conquest and expansion. And so I think that's going to be helpful also, now that we're talking about American imperialism. So I'm going to get my map set up here, because I'm going to need this. So the time period that we're covering basically is the turn of the century from the 1800s to the 1900s. And I plan to drop us off right at 1314, where World War I kicks off. And that's where we're going to start class next time. I have to resist the temptation, because when we get to the 20th century, this is where we're really getting into the bread and butter of what I like to study. So I have to resist the temptation to not take too long and spend 3 months talking about World War I. Anyways, we'll manage. So American imperialism. First, start with, my slide is not changing. What's wrong with my slide? There it goes. So big picture idea. Countries behave in their own self-interest and try to justify it as morally excellent. So another way of saying this is countries behave in their self-interest. If you think of that chart I just drew, that countries, they get hungry. They get hungry to expand. They get hungry to dominate other lands and people and so forth. They're acting in their self-interest. But since that almost sounds like a dog-eat-dog world, the most powerful are the ones that prevail, but they also try to justify it as morally excellent. And a lot of this comes through the idea of social Darwinism, that idea that if you are the dominant race, that you are morally obligated to expand that race, to grow your population, and to dominate other people. It becomes a moral imperative to do so. So they use that kind of thinking to justify their idea of conquest and dominating other cultures. And all of this comes from Enlightenment ideals, as they claim. But hopefully you guys are recognizing, spent a long time talking about the Enlightenment, how this idea is almost a perversion of Enlightenment, that all men are not created equal if you are a superior race to them, and you're morally obligated to subjugate them. So they claim that this is behaving in accordance with Enlightenment principles, but in reality it's a perversion of it, and it's doing away with it almost completely. So I'm hoping you guys recognize that, because that's an important thing. And so 3 things that not just American imperialism, but all forms of imperialism are competing for is 1, new markets. Industrial Revolution is still happening. New fields, new inventions beget other new fields. For example, automobiles, which are invented. That's an industry, building automobiles. But that industry begets other industries. Now you have a demand for rubber. You have a demand for metal. You have a demand for all these other things that are inputs to that final product. You also have other demands like roads, bridges, and so forth. And so you have a new invention, which becomes a new industry in itself, and it begets other new industries also. And so it becomes a cycle of expansion. And what's happening in the Industrial Revolution is these countries are producing more things than what they can consume. So what they need is, to expand, they have new markets, new people to sell their goods to bring them more wealth. So you have factories that are outputting all these resources very abundantly, more than what they can consume, and they need new markets, new peoples, new populations to sell these goods to. So you have new markets, but imperialism also brings new raw materials, materials that maybe you don't have in your home country that you need to produce these other goods. And then this third one is particularly unique to American imperialism, which we're going to spend some time talking about today, is naval bases. And we'll get to that more later on. But the United States at this point is not a strong naval power yet. Britain is still the supreme naval power. Japan is an ascending power. We're getting into the world wars. And Japan is building up and the industrialization has arrived in Japan also. So naval bases, that's pretty unique to American imperialism. We're going to take a closer look at that later on. But you have this idea of manifest destiny. I don't know how well you can see this picture, but what you see here is you have American settlers, they're farming, they're building railroads, they're going west. You have a cowboy that's chasing bison. You have wagons that are back here in the background. Over here you have, a city. You can't see probably, you have a city. And the idea is they're expanding westwards. Everyone is moving this way. You see the bison are running out. Your textbook talked about that, bison population, and it's declining. And bison was a form of food, sustenance for the Indians. And as bison are being hunted, it's diminishing the food sources of the Indians. You see the Indians that are fleeing. This isn't an American history course, but if it were, we would spend quite a bit of time talking about the Trail of Tears. Hopefully you guys are familiar with that, with the resettlement of Native Americans onto reservations and so forth. It was a very, very dark chapter in American history. So if this were an American history course, I would spend more time talking about that. But the idea of manifest destiny, you have right in the middle, you have this angel that is leading the way westward, and that it is basically, it's manifest. Well, I'll get to that in a second. But this phrase, manifest destiny, comes from a journalist, John O'Sullivan, where he writes this phrase, this paragraph: the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent by providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. And so, yearly multiplying millions, the population is growing by millions every year. And as our manifest destiny to spread our population. So the word manifest basically means clear or obvious. And then providence, with God's help. That with God's help, He will help us expand. And so the idea, a rephrasing of that basically is God created the continent for the United States to expand, and it is obviously our destiny to do so. And so what this, remember in our big picture that countries act in their self-interest and they justify it as being morally excellent. So that's basically what you see happening here, is a very dark chapter. In the field of history, you look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there's ugly things happening here with the Native Americans, but there is a lot of good happening out of it too. So there's good and there's bad. And so I don't want to paint it as, there's all kinds of bad happening here. There is, that's true, but two things can be true at once. And so one of the things I want you to try to appreciate is the complexity of what's happening. There are some things that are unforgivable, that are just straight up wrong with the massacres of Native Americans. But there's good things that come that we will get to in time. The question for a Christian is, does the ends justify the means? I could spend forever talking about that, but this isn't the time or place or class for that. Maybe we'd have a discussion if you guys were here. And so you have this idea of manifest destiny, that it is, the continent is created by God for the United States, for Americans, to expand. Kind of the same idea, the same mentality as Europeans in the scramble for Africa, that they're spreading Christianity. We went through the speech by David Livingstone that he gave at Cambridge about expanding into Africa, he explicitly connects commercialization, industrialization with Christianity, that you cannot spread one without the other, that these are both basically logical conclusions of the Enlightenment. So you have this idea of manifest destiny, expanding westward. One way of illustrating that is San Francisco Bay. 1848, it's just a bay with a few houses, basically nothing there. 2 years later in 1850, you have a city there. And part of this was fueled much by the gold rush, the California gold rush happening at this time. But the expansion westward was, there was this appeal even in Europe that if you want to be on the frontier, on the edge of what's happening, you need to go to America and settle in the West. And this is where the land of opportunity is happening. And so you had this just mass migration expanding westward very, very rapidly under this idea of manifest destiny. So Again, you probably can't see it, it's very small. But you have the original territories, 1783, expanding basically to the Mississippi River. And then you had they're reaching the West Coast by 1848, and then the Oregon Country in 1846. So in a very short amount of time, about 65 years to reach the West Coast. And so a very rapid expansion across the continent from ocean to ocean. And so that geographical feature will come up later more and more, that the United States is on two major oceans. That is a very unique characteristic of the geography of the United States. And so, we've talked about before the Civil War, after the end of the Civil War, because this is right during that time. Primarily what we're talking about today is the decades immediately after the Civil War. With Reconstruction, rebuilding America, bringing the Union back together, reunifying the North and the South. We've already talked about railroad, new railroads, the race to the Pacific, the first railroad to get to the Pacific. And you had former Union soldiers, former Confederate soldiers coming together, embarking on this common task, expanding westward, in this way of reunifying the country. And the railroad was one way of symbolizing that. Largely because of economic opportunity. You have farmers that are going west with tons of farmland in the west that they can expand to. You have miners in the gold rush that find economic opportunity. You have railroad workers that are just working for the railroads. You have multiple railroad companies that are trying to expand westward at the same time. And then with the railroad companies, you have all the other industries that come with that. You have hotels and saloons and restaurants and everything that comes with construction workers constantly moving westward. And there's this idea of, to use a Latin term, tabula rasa, which basically means a blank slate. And so what all of these people moving westward is they see the West as it's a blank slate. It's empty. It's a pristine wilderness that's just ripe for the taking. David Livingstone used some of the same kind of language in his speech at Cambridge about Africa, that Africa is a pristine place. It's ripe for exploitation. There's resources there. There's opportunity. But as we already mentioned, was it really a blank slate if you have American Indians that have been here for who knows how long, that have, this is their home. And so as you have expansion westward, you have the Indian Wars, and you have massacres. You have Custard, Captain or Colonel Custard. And so you have different stories like that of massacres of Indians, that part of this manifest destiny, that it's a moral imperative to expand westward, which, if necessary, includes massacring these people. So as Americans, as Christians, these are things that we should wrestle with, not whitewash it, but take an honest look at it. And so this idea of tabula rasa that goes together with this idea of manifest destiny. And that's important. So you have a picture here of railroad networks expanding westward. You have at least two of them that go from coast to coast, and then San Francisco, which just becomes a booming metropolis very quickly on the West Coast. So in 1880, you have this growing network of railroads that are trying to tame the land. You have mountains in here. There's actually a TV show about just this railroad expansion, and it talks some of the themes are the Indian Wars and trying to build a railroad while fending off Indians that are hostile, that are trying to sabotage your work and are attacking you. And slave labor was used for a lot of this, and you'd have workers going on strike. We're not going to go out there with Indians threatening us every day. So then they have to hire protectors and so forth. And so it's quite a big deal to expand westward in hostile territory. Nevertheless, that's what's happening. And so this idea of manifest destiny, the United States is the new world. It's still considered the new world. And you have the old world, Europe, Asia, Africa, that all of those continents are basically is occupied. The political space is taken up. And if you want to continue expansion, you have to go west. That the west is the frontier. That is the frontier that you expand, going westwards. And so this idea of frontier becomes a very central part of the American identity. That frontiers define America. And particularly during this time, they spread the ideas of progress, civilization, enlightenment, industrialization, and Christianity. So question, where do frontiers end? That's kind of a loaded question because, if it ends, then it's no longer a frontier. But the point of asking that question is that expansion westward, you would think would just, that's a wrong marker, don't use that marker, would just end at the Pacific Ocean. You reach San Francisco Bay and, you've reached the coast. We are now a coast-to-coast country. But as we're going to take a look through the rest of this class is they didn't have their eye just there. They had their eye much further west into the Pacific Ocean and ultimately even into China. We'll get to that shortly. But even today, when we think of the idea of frontiers, I think of Elon Musk and trying to frontier into the solar system and to the moon and to the Mars, ocean exploration. That this idea of frontiers and going into the unknown is a very central part of the American identity. And I think that's something to be celebrated, but it's also something you have to look critically about as well. And so, again, I know I've shown this picture, this painting many times, but I think it captures so well just the mentality of the time, the white man's burden. Again, you have Great Britain and you have Uncle Sam, the United States, and they're carrying these barbarians to civilization, out of their ignorance, out of their brutality and their barbarism, and so forth. You even see different characters that are mocking the people that are carrying them. This idea that it's a thankless task. We're carrying the burden of these barbarians to civilization, and they don't even appreciate the work that's going into it. Again, this idea of social Darwinism, but that it's a moral obligation. In the speech, Rudyard Kipling, he talks about sending your best. You send the best enlightened individuals, send the best Europeans, send the best Americans into your frontiers to spread these ideas of enlightenment ideals. Basically, the idea is that these are the standard. These are what we want humanity to be. They should be the ones going forth and trying to transform the world. David Livingstone, if you remember the speech that I read last time, he was giving his speech. It was a graduation address at Cambridge, and he's appealing to these graduates. You are our best. You are the ones we need to send into Africa and to commercialize and to spread Christianity. So the idea that send your best, your highest evolved, perhaps some would say even, that they're morally obligated to take forth this thankless task. And so you have manifest destiny, and then next, to take this abstract idea of manifest destiny and to codify it into an actual policy is what we see happening in the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was really articulated back in the 1820s, but it wasn't really called that until about the 1870s. But the idea of the Monroe Doctrine is that you have, up until this point, you have the British that colonized North America. You have the French colonizing Canada and also Mexico. The Portuguese and Spanish colonizing Latin America, South America. And what the Monroe Doctrine basically is saying is that the Western Hemisphere is closed to any more European colonization. No more European colonies. That this is our sphere of influence. You European powers, you can have Africa, you can have Asia, you can have whatever else, but this, the Monroe Doctrine says the Western Hemisphere is closed to any further European colonization. This is our hemisphere. It's about the most American statement I've made this entire class. We own this hemisphere. But that's basically what the Monroe Doctrine was. There was fear that, the French, after Napoleon, Maximilian, would expand northward into Canada and might try to reconquer the Louisiana Purchase, which Jefferson bought from Napoleon. That money goes to fund the Napoleonic Wars, but a lot of that money comes back to the United States in the form of buying weapons to fight against the British, which is kind of an ironic twist, which is when the United States kind of first became the world's arms dealer, sort of, basically. And so you still have colonies present in South America, but what you see is the United States is beginning to negotiate on behalf of these American countries to negotiate European colonists out of Africa, out of South America. Specifically in Venezuela is one example, which your chapter talks about, where the United States basically, this is our sphere of influence, we will represent these American countries, that many of them are fighting for revolution. The Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, property. To preserve these rights, that governments are instituted among men. So in other words, we've talked about the social contract, that these men have the ability to rule themselves. They have their own political rights. The Enlightenment was about political equality. Everyone having equal rights, everyone equal for the law, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all the things that we get in the Bill of Rights, that these countries have a right to all of that, to self-governance. And so you have the United States standing up on behalf of all of these countries, fighting for their own revolution, standing up for their liberal ideals, and pushing out the European colonists. And so under this Monroe Doctrine, that's what the United States becomes increasingly aggressive in representing. I'm actually jumping ahead of myself. I have a whole slide about this, but that's okay. So this is one way of visualizing it, is a dog marking its territory. He's peeing on the tree. That's kind of what the United States is doing, is we're marking our territory. This is, Europe doesn't belong here. This is our home. This is our sphere of influence. That's a term you'll probably hear me using more often, is sphere of influence. So now the slide that I jumped ahead on. Monroe Doctrine, 1815 is when it was first kind of articulated, even though it wasn't called Monroe Doctrine until way later. Colonial powers seek to stamp out liberal revolutions and reassert absolutist monarchy. But they're standing up for liberal ideals such as self-governance, consent of the government, freedom of speech, religion, representative government. I kind of went over all that already. I jumped ahead. And so, kind of moving back to North America. So William Seward, he was Secretary of State in the 1800s. A famous quote, all prosperous nations must expand. I'm going to see a quotation mark right there. All prosperous nations must expand. That is a moral imperative. And so William Seward is well known for the Alaska Purchase of 1867. So Alaska up to this point belonged to Russia. And of course, Russia during this time, we've not talked much about Russia in this class, hardly at all. We're going to, much more after World War I, which is kind of disappointing. I took a whole class on the history of Russia, and I didn't get to use any of it in this class. Anyways, you have Russia expanding westward also. They eventually make the jump across the Bering Strait into Russian Alaska. And so they didn't even call it Alaska back then, just the Russian, what do they call it, Russian wilderness, or I can't remember now. And expanding into North America. So Russia is also expanding. They have expanded the most into basically with barren wasteland. And it made the jump into North America with Alaska. But the idea was, and the challenge for Russia was, the further west they expand, they're conquering such vast territory out there that they can't control all of it, that they can't build quick enough to go that far west. And so it's kind of this idea of, they bit off more than they can chew when they claimed Alaska. And so Russia was more than ready to sell Alaska. We have no use for it. They didn't think it had any worth at all. And so you have, I'd love to take the time to tell you the story of, specifically how the purchase came out. But basically you have William Seward, who purchases Alaska without the consent of Congress. It's kind of a funny story, but I don't have time to get into it. And he purchases, I think it was at like 4 a.m. in the morning or 3 a.m. in the morning, when he purchased Alaska, when the Russian ambassador came to visit him. And he purchased Alaska without the consent of Congress, and Alaska took on the nickname of Seward's Folly, or Seward's Icebox was another name. And the idea was that there's nothing in Alaska. It's barren land. It's worth nothing. Why spend $7 million? It's way far up there. It's too far to settle. We're not, yes, we have manifest destiny that we are going to conquer the entire North American continent. But there was this, in Congress, was this idea of anti-imperialism. Because there was still this idea in, I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit again, there were still people in Congress that recognized that this imperialist game, this idea of conquest, kind of subverts these ideas of Enlightenment principles, of people being able to govern themselves. I'll get to more of that here in a little bit. So you have 1867, the purchase of Alaska, and that becomes a pretty big deal in this Monroe Doctrine era. In 1898, you have the Spanish-American War. This begins specifically in Cuba, right here. Cuba is a Spanish colony. And so with 1898, you're just a couple decades removed from the Civil War, and there's this mood during the Reconstruction era that the United States is finally, is reunited, and now we can start looking outward. We can start looking abroad. Up until this point, the 1860s was the Civil War. The country was broken. The mending together, expanding westward becomes kind of a rallying, a cry or issue for, rebuilding the United States. But the idea, not just looking to the West Coast, but beyond our coasts. One of these is Cuba, where the Spanish still have a colony. And so the United States takes on a more assertive foreign policy. And you have President William McKinley, this quote of his, "The people of Cuba are and of right ought to be free and independent." So what he's saying, again, you have the United States standing up for these liberal revolutions of Latin American countries and saying Cuba has a right to rule themselves too, not to be part of the Spanish Empire. They have a right to rule, and a part of this Monroe Doctrine is that we are going to represent Cuba against the Spanish. And then there was the Teller Amendment. No man, no party can fight with any chance of final success against a cosmic tendency. No cleverness, no popularity avails against the spirit of the age, or the zeitgeist, to throw a big word at you. So in other words, that this is a cosmic tendency that the United States is going to protect these lands, that this is our sphere of influence. Sorry, that wasn't the Teller Amendment. That was just a quote by John Hayes. The Teller Amendment was basically where the United States, the Congress, basically declares we are not going to war with Spain in order to make Cuba our own colony, but that the Teller Amendment was a pledge that we are not going to colonize Cuba after we throw out the Spanish. We're just freeing Cuba for themselves. We're fighting their war revolution for them, basically, is what the Teller Amendment was. And so the war kicks off when the United States send the battleship, the Maine, to Havana Harbor. And mysteriously, still to this day, we don't know how, the ship blows up. And in newspapers, you have this rallying cry, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. You see that in newspapers across America. And so this idea of, to borrow from World War II, it's Hitler's Reichstag fire. It doesn't matter who set the fire. It doesn't matter who destroyed the Maine, who bombed the Maine. we're going to blame who we want to blame. It's the smoking gun. We don't know who actually did it, but we're going to blame the Spanish just because we want to. It's convenient. It probably was the Spanish. It could have been Cubans that were offended that the U.S. was present also. Nevertheless, this became the cause for declaring war on the Spanish. So the war kicks off in Cuba, but the war quickly expands to the Philippines, all the way over here, and all the way across the Pacific Ocean. And so that's what this map is here. You have a U.S. fleet from Hong Kong that makes its way down to the Philippines, which is also a Spanish colony. And on August 13, 1898, very handily destroys the Spanish fleet. It was a very easy defeat. And so very quickly, almost overnight, very quickly, Philippines changes hands from a Spanish colony. Now the Americans occupy the Philippines. Now this is an American territory. And so a major debate that started picking up is, what in the world do we do with the Philippines? What do we do with it now? And so we're very split. Congress is very split. Do we keep ourselves, or do we, there's also this idea that they're not capable of ruling themselves. They're not enlightened enough to rule themselves. We believed in these principles, of, the right to self-governorship that we saw in South America, but there's also others that have this idea they're not enlightened enough, they're not civilized enough to govern themselves. They need an imperialist power to govern over them. So Teddy Roosevelt, I believe he was vice president, he's about to become president, quoted as saying, "If I had my way, we would annex those islands tomorrow and hoist our flag over the island, leaving all details for after action." So he very much wanted to just claim it as an American colony. And then, as President McKinley here, a quote from him: "The Philippines were a gift from the gods. There was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos, uplift and civilize them, and Christianize them." So McKinley saw this as an opportunity too, to civilize the Filipinos, to Christianize them, and to claim this as a colony. And so again, there was this debate: what do we do with the Philippines? And so one common argument you would hear is U.S. soldiers died trying to conquer the Philippines, although in reality, I don't know the number off the top of my head, there's very few American casualties. It was a very easy win, but there was this argument that if U.S. soldiers died for conquering the Philippines, why should we have to give up what they died for? So that was one compelling argument you would hear. Another argument you would hear is, this is one quote I came across: "Dewey took Manila with the loss of one man and all our institutions." So in other words, what he's saying is, there wasn't many lives that were lost conquering the Philippines, but this idea of claiming the Philippines as our own colony goes against everything of our founding principles that we find in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. I've quoted many times in this class the Declaration of Independence, the right to self-governance, that if a government does not properly protect the rights of a people, it is not just the right but the responsibility of the people to overthrow such government, installing a new government that does protect their rights. Basically paraphrasing Declaration of Independence. And so what that quote was saying is, betraying all of the institution is, we say we believe in all these ideas in the Declaration of Independence, your right to self-governance and consent of the governed, social contract theory, which we've talked about, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. And there was a strong idea that we are betraying the enlightened liberal principles of self-determination and consent of the governed by claiming the Philippines as our own colony. So absorption without consent of the Filipino people, without them agreeing to it, violates the very ideals being talked about in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and so forth. And so, to go back to this quote, Dewey took Manila, the capital city of the Philippines, with the loss of one man, but with the death of all of our institutions. We're betraying the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the enlightened principles that they're founded upon. And so, a term that I don't know if you guys, I hear quite a bit is American idealism. And it's a term that back in this age of imperialism had a specific meaning, but today when people use it, everybody has their own idea of what they mean by it. If you guys were here, I would ask you guys what you guys think that term means, American idealism. I think most people probably they don't mean anything super specific. They just mean it kind of ambiguously. But some ideas that people might have for American idealism is just we are the most powerful military power in the history of humanity. That makes us, another way people say it, not American idealism, but American exceptionalism is another phrase with a very similar meaning. That the United States is exceptional because we have the strongest military in the history of human history. Well, yeah, that is pretty exceptional, but if you use that power and just conquer whatever you want with it, how does that make you any different than the Roman Empire or the Mongolian Empire or all of these empires through history that just conquer? Remember, the big idea in our first slide was that countries act in their self-interest and they will justify it as being morally excellent. And so, during this time, the idea of American exceptionalism, American idealism, is that the United States is going to use its military power to protect the right of these countries to have governments that represent the people and that respect human rights and individual liberties. And that standing for those kinds of ideals is what makes the United States exceptional. So it's not military might per se, or it's not, we're a free country. There's a lot of other countries that are free countries. There's a lot of other countries that are much more free than the United States. So it's not just freedom or military power that makes the United States exceptional. I need to step off my soapbox. Anyways, moving on. So the Spanish-American War wasn't confined to just the Caribbean and the Philippines, but it expanded, I'm kind of lumping this together. During this time of American imperialism, you have Alaska here, expanding westward to the Philippines. Hawaii was acquired at this time. You have Samoa Islands down here. You have Guam, which is right here. The Philippines here. So expanding the frontier past California coast into the Pacific Ocean, the largest ocean on the planet. And ultimately, the idea was looking towards China. During this time is, we're not far removed from the Opium Wars. And Britain had installed what's called open door policy, where anybody can come in and trade openly with the massive Chinese market. So open door policy is something that is present here in China right now, that it's open for trade. Because we looked at trade with China before, where China was very strict about who was allowed to come in and trade. That's why the Opium Wars happened. British come in and say, we want to trade more with you guys, getting the people addicted to opium, and then going in, conquering the country basically, and so forth. I'm not going to rehash all that again. And so a lot of people were looking westward across the Pacific Ocean into Asia, into China, the vast markets there. But Seward, Secretary of State William Seward, he was also looking eastward too, to Iceland, Greenland, Canada even. So there were attempts to expand into Canada even. And so you have the United States trying to expand in these areas, all part of this idea of manifest destiny, expanding our sphere of influence into the frontiers. I keep jumping ahead of myself in these slides. So you have these different islands. There's other islands too I've not mentioned that the United States has, taken into its sphere of influence. But yeah, Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines, all of these are stepping stones to China. So this is a quote. America's commerce must be, sorry for the typos, America's commerce must be with Asia. The Pacific is our ocean. Where shall we turn for consumers of our surplus? Trying to expand our markets. Geography answers that question. China is our natural customer. So that's from Indiana Senator at the time, Alfred Beveridge. And so many congressmen, many Americans were looking, we need to expand so far into the frontier that we're expanding into China. This is a prime opportunity to take advantage of this open door policy in China. So to go back to social Darwinism, social Darwinists are looking at all of this that are happening and are hailing the achievements that are happening because of their teachings. Some of the things they observe is, you have something I've not even talked about really, is missionary diplomacy. You have missionaries that are expanding into Africa, into South America, Western, European, American missionaries, a massive movement of missionaries going out to spread Christianity and civilization. And Darwinists see this as missionaries are saving many souls and civilizing many souls. And you have commercial groups are trying to exploit African markets, the Chinese market, these very backwards, Eastern, strange cultures that need civilizing. They need culture, they need commercializing, and so forth. And then, again, specifically, we're going to get to, at the very end of this lesson, proponents for a larger Navy are seeing that become possible. We're going to see it when we get to Teddy Roosevelt here in a few minutes. So these slides are kind of actually out of order. That's okay. But we've still not settled the question, what do we do with the Philippines? That became a major issue for the United States, a very present debate at the time. And so a certain passage from White Man's Burden that I think is kind of relative. Take up the white man's burden, ye dared not stoop to less, no call to loud on freedom to cloak ye weariness. We've taken up the white man's burden of ebony and brown, now will you kindly tell Rudyard how we may put it down? So that last line, the last two lines, now you tell me, how do we put this down? How do we put down this burden, this white man's burden? And you have this idea emerging that becomes an important theme in the 20th and 21st century. This idea of nation building. This idea basically, I have examples of here, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Philippines, Iran, where the United States will go in, topple the regime like we saw with Saddam Hussein in Iraq, which we will eventually get to. Hopefully, I'm hoping if we have enough time. The United States is toppling these governments. There is no government anymore, just an American occupation. What now? There's no functional government. We've toppled the government. You have American presence here, like in the Philippines, like in Iraq, Afghanistan, so forth. And now you broke it. You own it now. Maybe they had a dictator that was a terrible person. You got rid of that dictator. Now you filled the void. You filled the power vacuum. And now what you have to do is you have to undertake this project of nation building, rebuilding the nation, which is still a very present debate in politics today. Is this idea of nation building something that the United States should be doing? Taking American taxpayer dollars and rebuilding these countries where we've launched military campaigns into. And this is what's happening with the Philippines. What do we do with the Philippines? We don't believe they can govern themselves, so we train them to form their own government. Do we adopt it as a colony? So this idea of rebuilding a nation is a very long-term project that takes a lot of commitment. It's much easier to send in your ships and your army to topple a regime. It's much harder to rebuild the country. And so kind of this interventionist foreign policy is almost short-sighted. It's easy to conquer, but nation building is a much, much larger task. So that's what's happening in the Philippines. You've picked up the white man's burden. How do you put this burden down now? And so this is a graphic you've seen before on my PowerPoint on Orientalism. This lens, this worldview that you see the world, these cultures are backwards and they're uncivilized. And when you see these regions of the world in that way, it's much easier to impose policies on them that are very harmful for the local populations, the indigenous populations. So anyways, that's a continuing theme of nation building that we're going to see more in the 20th and, if we ever get there, the 21st century. Even today, in the news this week has been about President Trump talking about downsizing troops in Afghanistan down to 2,500 troops. And this idea of, we've tried to rebuild the nation of Afghanistan after the war there. It began after 9/11. And this nation-building project in Afghanistan has only had very limited successes, with massive American casualties, massive taxpayer burden. But how do you put this burden down now? You broke it, now you own it. You can't just walk away. So yeah, that's going to become more of a theme as we get going. So Teddy Roosevelt, President McKinley assassinated. Vice President Teddy Roosevelt comes to the office of president. He's a hero of the Spanish-American War. He is an avid outdoorsman, a big game hunter. You see him hunting an elephant, riding an elk, a moose, not an elk. And he's very much an outdoorsman. Fashions himself as a cowboy. He's very, this idea of exceptional American. He's a war hero. He's not afraid to, his famous quote, "Speak softly, carry a big stick." And so he has this very particular image of him. He also cultivated this image like, I don't bluff. Like, you don't bluff. If you make a threat, you mean that threat and you follow through with it. And that bleeds through into his foreign policy also. So we've talked about the Suez Canal. To remind you, Suez Canal connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. The French built the Suez Canal. We've already talked about the Ottomans. The French funded it by selling shares. Ottomans owned a majority of the shares of the canal, sold those shares to the British to try to pay down their war debt from the Crimean War. But you have this canal that is now completed that shortens this route around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean, where there's still a lot of trade happening. There has been the entire length of this class since 1405, but now the canal shortens this, much more efficient. And the United States says we need a canal like that because it's a long ways around South America into the Pacific Ocean. So Teddy Roosevelt sees this canal, how great it's been for Europe, and says, we need a canal too, right across here, across Panama. So he undertakes this project to build a canal, 13,000 miles around this way, 52, from New York to San Francisco, 13,000 miles this way, 5,200 miles this way. And so they decide they talk about building it in Nicaragua, they finally settle in Panama. And so he begins construction on the Panama Canal. And Roosevelt, he also undertook, one of the things he's very well known for is rebuilding the Navy. Not rebuilding, we didn't really have one before for much of, but building a Navy. And so he builds what's called the Great White Fleet. And I think it was 16 or 17 battleships and lots of other smaller ships that under Roosevelt are constructed. And he basically wants to send this Great White Fleet on a world tour, quite literally a world tour. He wants to leave New York, send them to San Francisco, and then from there they're going to go out into the Pacific Ocean. And it's basically like a parade, visiting from island to island, country to country. And he sends his fleet completely circumnavigating the globe to show off this new fleet, to show the world, hey, the United States has arrived. So some of the reasons to show that the U.S. is not a force to be trifled with anymore. We're not just a small former colony anymore. We are a force to be reckoned with. Number two, to remind Japan that they are not the only ascending Pacific power. So you have Japan that is expanding their navy also. Eventually, the U.S. Navy and Japanese Navy are going to come to a head eventually in Pearl Harbor in World War II. But you have the U.S. Navy and the Japanese Navy that are competing for the Pacific Ocean as part of their sphere of influence. So remind Japan that they are not the only ascending Pacific power. Also to remind Europe that the U.S. isn't small anymore. But also to provide practical experience for the logistics of a two-ocean navy. A defining characteristic of the United States, it's on both oceans. If you look at this map carefully and you try to find another major world power that is on two major oceans, you're not going to find any. Only the United States has significant amount of Atlantic coast and Pacific coast, Hawaii, Alaska. And so Roosevelt wants to build a navy, so it's a two-ocean navy. European powers do have a naval presence in the Pacific, but the United States wants to be able to power project into both oceans, both east and west. And this provides practical experience for how do we have a two-ocean navy? How do we project naval power far and abroad? A book that was published at this time by Alfred Mahan called The Influence of Sea Power on World History, I believe it was called. A very influential work that influenced the United States and Britain and Germany and France, all of these countries. And to this day, the U.S. Navy is the primary source that emanates from the U.S. military strength, from our Navy. The ability to power project across all oceans the Navy, perhaps more than any other military branch, is a source of our global power projection. And that starts with Teddy Roosevelt. Also learned lessons on ship design and navigation, and a cool new paint job, which is not a joke actually, because they call it the Great White Fleet because they had this really fancy white and gold paint job. And it was supposed to be just a really beautiful looking ships that Roosevelt just wanted the world to see. Which actually, it's not a joke, it's kind of funny, but it actually is a reason. To show off not just our powerful fleet, but our beautiful fleet also. But undertaking a task like this this quote, "I want all failures, blunders, and shortcomings to be made apparent in times of peace and not in times of war." So Roosevelt didn't necessarily even see World War II or World War I about to happen. He just saw, I want us to work out these kinks in times of peace, not in war. And so, I've got a lot of pictures in there again. So there's some major risk. You can see is the route they took, circumnavigating the globe. Some risk they could get lost. That's a real possibility. They've never undertaken a major, navigation task like this. Or the ships could break down. This is a very new Navy, these are very new ships. Or the ships could ram into each other. There's a lot of these ships. So there were these very real risks for a brand new Navy. And the whole idea of circumnavigating the globe is to show off our Navy. We are a power that's arrived. But if any one of these things were to happen, that would be kind of humiliating on a world stage. So there were very real risks. But Teddy Roosevelt, he wanted to find out, gain practical experience in how to have a two-ocean Navy. So he learned some lessons. One, he learned the need for a Panama Canal. That if we're going to project into both oceans, we need to be able to send ships back and forth between oceans very quickly, very much more efficiently. Thus, we need a Panama Canal. Another was a need for naval bases. So when this fleet was circumnavigating the globe, they didn't have a way to refuel these ships and to resupply these ships. And so they floated different ideas. We're going to have to send merchant ships to send more fuel and more food and stuff to these ships to resupply them. We don't have the naval bases like the British do in colonies all over the Indian Ocean, all over the Pacific, so forth. We don't have these naval bases to resupply. So what happened actually with this, this undertaking was Roosevelt hired British ships to resupply the American ships. But it revealed this need. We need naval bases. If we're going to project power globally, we need naval bases to be able to do that. And that perhaps that might mean colonies abroad. And we also just need more ships. We need more smaller ships, was another lesson learned. So I'm going to start bringing this to a close. But to go back to our big picture of everything that's going on with our last lecture and this one, countries behave in their own self-interest and try to justify it as morally excellent. So that's kind of what I've tried to demonstrate to you. So the Panama Canal was completed in August of 1914. That's an interesting month because that is the very month that World War I kicks off. That's where we're going to pick up next class. But just very quickly, I want to go through just very quickly some of the causes of World War I. I've laid a lot of the groundwork with the Industrial Revolution, the scramble for Africa, colonial competition, this social Darwinism of racial superiority. I think I'm jumping ahead of myself again, but that's okay. So we've talked about Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, who reunified Germany in 1872, right in the middle of this time that we've been covering these last two classes. Bismarck is in international relations, there's an entire subfield of Bismarckian diplomacy. He was just an incredible diplomat, a phenomenal brain. And we're going to get more into this next class. I don't want to get too much into it now. But just to show you a little bit where we're going, you have Germany right here, right in the middle of Europe. And to the east, they have Russia. And to the west, they have France, the British also. And so they're surrounded on both sides by threatening powers. And so what Bismarck tries to do is to form all of these diplomatic relations and defense agreements with countries so that they have strategic alliances that keep these wars from breaking out, that keeps Germany safe. If this country declares war on this country, then this country is going to come in and protect this country, so forth. It's really complicated. I'll break it down more later. But some of these mutual defense alliances, Russia is allied with Serbia. If Serbia is attacked, Russia will come to defend Serbia. Germany has an alliance with Austria-Hungary, the Habsburg Empire. France has an alliance with Russia. Britain and France both have an alliance with Belgium. Japan has an alliance with Britain. So you have these just interweaving, complicated web of alliances that, as long as Otto von Bismarck has been the one designing all of this, has worked out great in Germany's favor, because Germany they see they're surrounded by powers that are threatening to them, and they start creating war plans. Kind of this idea of a paranoia. But if the threat is real, if the threat really is present, are you really paranoid? And so you can call it paranoia, you can call it something else. I'm going to call it paranoia. But they become very paranoid about being surrounded. Germany was just unified as a country in 1872. These countries are much, much older. They have colonies abroad. They have lots of resources and militaries. But Germany has a very large population. And so they feel very threatened. They start wargaming out all of these scenarios. If war were to happen, we don't have a reason to go to war, but if war does happen, we want to have alliances that work in our favor, that balance in our favor. And that's kind of what this system that Otto von Bismarck tried to set up. The other reasons I have are very closely connected, and they're almost one reason really. But you have imperialism, which we've talked about. But you have competition, ideas of Darwinism, ideas of racial superiority, and the Industrial Revolution. So you have imperialism, and kind of the subpoints are the same, nationalism. I thought I had one more. Nationalism. But you have this competition, this idea of each European power is a supreme power, racial superiority. They're morally obligated to expand their race if they are the superior race. But you have the Industrial Revolution also, where you have not just new factories and new industries being invented, but you have new weapons being invented. You have all these countries that are building up their militaries, new weapons, new machine guns, all these new shiny weapons that have never been used before ever in warfare. And they get kind of anxious with all this imperialism that's happening. They get kind of anxious. We want to use these weapons, basically. It's a little bit oversimplified. But that's kind of what's happening. You have an arms race in Europe that starts ramping up as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So that's where I'm going to leave off this class. And so I've tried my best to try to set the stage for World War I. And kind of what you see, you have all of these reasons, but they're kind of sleepwalking into war without even realizing it. But when we get to next class, we're going to look more carefully. We're going to start with World War I. I'm going to resist the urge to not spend like the next 15 classes on World War I. We're starting to really get into the parts of history where I really thoroughly enjoy studying. So this will be a lot of fun for me. Thank you for joining, and join us back next time.